Tony Gosling is a historian and journalist who joins us. Tony Gosling, when you take a look at the exchange that took place, well, not exchange, the statements made there by the foreign ministers of the respective countries, Russia and Ukraine, obviously it doesn't show any opening there for any type of peace or peace talks or anything on that in that regard. What are we looking at in terms of the way that this conflict is moving forward?
Well, hang on a second. It's just ringing the hour here. Hang on a second. Yeah. So I mean, the Russians and the Chinese have made it clear that they don't really have confidence in the international order at the moment. That is to say, the institutions like the United Nations, etc. And so this is being framed as a Russian invasion, a Russian crime. It's nothing of the sort. It's actually a Western coup. And the understanding around the world by most people that bother to look into it is that NATO has been advancing up closer and closer to the Russian borders, closer and closer to Moscow. And I would draw a parallel actually with the Middle East peace process and the Northern Ireland peace process, which eventually worked out, thank God, we had here in the UK. I don't think the West actually wants peace. They want to ramp up the tension on Russia. In fact, what we've seen is the RAND Corporation report from 2019 in the United States, one of their military think tanks, where you can actually read line by line the American plans to ramp up tension, ratchet it up on Moscow and on Putin and on Russia. And this is what we're seeing, I think, unfolding now, is that the idea is to box Russia in, to try and isolate Russia. But of course, this is going to fail. Now, the people who are going to do very well as this all fails. So what I'm saying really is that I don't think that the West wants peace. I think they might obviously talk about it, but at the bottom of it, what they want is to use the opportunity for peace, to take that away, to snatch that away, and use it as an opportunity to ramp up the tension on people like Putin. And we've seen today here in the Western press, I mean, you may well not have seen it, but the amazing sight of the Azov battalion, which is not a neo-Nazi, it's actually a Nazi unit. These people do not just sometimes think about Nazis as okay. They are actually around this guy called Stefan Bandera. They see him as a hero, and he was a World War II Nazi. These units are following that ideology, and they were spoken of here in UK with the prisoner releases of the Azov units as the great heroes of Ukraine. Now, I was absolutely shocked and amazed to hear the Western media now talking about Nazis as heroes, and that's the extent to which the propaganda is going here in the West. So I think what we're witnessing is a takeover of these international institutions by NATO and by the West, but also a ramping up of the psychological warfare against the Western public to try to convince the the less intelligent amongst us that there's some kind of case against Russia. Well, there isn't, because the West has been pushing towards Russia for the last 20, nearly 30 years now. And that's why we're in the situation that we are in Ukraine.
Well, I've asked this before. Of course, this conflict has now developed into different stages. But what would a win by the U.S. look like, and what would a win by Russia look like?
Okay, good question. A win from the United States from this would be a war. That's what they want. They want a war in Europe. I mean, they've actually wanted that, and some would say many of the people who were liaising with the former Nazis at the end of the Second World War, such as General Patton, who had some Nazi sympathies, and people like Winston Churchill, wanted to resume the war at the end of the Second World War against the Soviet Union as it was at the time. And so I think now what we're seeing is that whole idea being rekindled right now as the United States, because of course the United States is thousands, maybe 4,000 miles away from this battlefield. They're unlikely to be touched, although the Russians may have other ideas. Obviously, you know, they have weapons to do that. A win from the Russians is very simple. What they want is they want some security to know that these HIMARS missiles that the West is supplying, and the Germans as well as supplying their Mars their version of this American missile is not going to be able to hit Russia or Moscow. So that's the danger that the Russians have been spelling out this week. Putin's speech, I saw, nobody, I don't think, here in Britain has been allowed to see the speech. What we've heard is we've heard BBC, ITV correspondents interpreting the speech, but we've not actually seen what he said. And what he's saying is, if you bring weapons in that can hit Russia, then we will understand that that is NATO, because they're NATO weapons. They're NATO coordinated weapons, and that is to say targeted using NATO satellites to target them. Then we will potentially use nuclear weapons. I mean, this is where we are now, is that the West seems to be trying to provoke Russia to do something similar. My worry is, of course, that we'll see potentially even a nuclear false flag attack. So that is to say the West blowing up a nuclear weapon and say, hey, the Russians have just fired this, in order to ramp up the tension, because I honestly think that that's what the West and the United States want, is they want a war to coordinate with the collapse of the financial system here in the West, and they think that they can actually take advantage of that. The win from the Russians, obviously, is security and peace. That means to say the Russian-speaking areas in the east of Ukraine, those provinces east of Kiev, if the Russians can agree, or if the Ukrainians in Kiev agree to say those Russian-speaking areas, well, you know, we'll allow these referenda to take place there, and we will allow the Russian people there to be independent, to be part of the Russian Federation if they wish. That then guarantees more security for the Russians. But by bringing in these weapons, as they've done last week, and they're now threatening to do more, these long-range weapons that can strike into Russia, coordinated by NATO, the NATO countries really do seem to be trying to provoke a much wider war, which people think, well, no one wants a war. Actually, no, some people do want a war. Financial people can make lots of money out of a war. And also, of course, those arms companies and arms industries can do that. So a lot of geopolitical advantage could be taken if there is a war. And the Americans, of course, are so far away that it may not affect them. So I think that's essentially what's going on here. And particularly we are seeing here in the UK an enormous amount of what I would call just simply propaganda. They call it psychological warfare, where people are simply lied to about events on the ground, and they're only told half the story. And now, of course, we have as people may know, we have effectively a firewall around Britain, like the Chinese originally had, to stop information getting into the UK from Russia. That is to say, the Russian state news agencies, like RT, like Sputnik, you now are not allowed to get them. You have to get something like a Tor browser or one of these systems in order to get round the firewall. So most people are no longer exposed to what they used to watch on the news every night, the English language Russia channel, which I used to be on, RT. And so there's a psychological warfare operation really being mounted against Britain's people by its own government, by its own military.
Thank you very much for that. Tony Gosling, historian and journalist there from London. Thank you.